It is the morning of November 7th, 1860, one day after Abraham Lincoln had won the 19th U.S. presidential election. John C. Breckinridge, John Bell, and Stephen A. Douglas all licked their wounds from their defeat to Lincoln. Just one day prior, on November 6th, Abraham Lincoln became the first Republican president in United States history. You'll notice that there was three losing candidates, who all had a relatively nice run at the presidency, especially when spectating the popular vote, of which Lincoln only won 40%. The 1860 presidential election featured four possible and probable political factions: the Republican Party, the Southern Democratic Party, the Constitutional Union Party, and the Democratic Party, all of which received over 10 electoral college votes. The Democratic Party was one of dysfunction at the time, hence why the party split into two factions. And the third party, the Constitutional Union Party, materialized as a viable option due to their candidate John Bell, who was opposed to the idea of seceding in the years leading up to the American Civil War. All this dysfunction between the three other parties left the door wide open for Abraham Lincoln to burst in and take his rightful place as the United States president. The clashing of four parties brings a certain frenzy to an election season that is unique to us modern voters, who are accustomed to the two-party system. This is just one reason why the 1860 U.S. election can sometimes be referred to as the most influential election in American history. After this election, the country began to align itself more and more towards a two-party system, with the Republican and Democratic parties being the most favorable amongst American voters. The fact of the matter is, the 1860 election was the third, but very last time in this country's history that four presidential candidates received more than 10 electoral votes. What was the largest landslide victory in presidential election history? Well, there are two major ways to lose an election. Although the Electoral College is the ultimate deciding factor, the popular vote is also worth looking at as well. The biggest landslide victories by Electoral College votes, in order, are: FDR won against Alf Landon by 515 electoral votes, Reagan won against Walter Mondale by 512 electoral votes, Tricky Dick won over McGovern by 503 electoral votes, Ronald Reagan won over Jimmy Carter by 440 electoral votes, and LBJ won over Barry Goldwater by 443 electoral votes. On a technicality though, however, the biggest landslide was, technically, during the 1872 election between Ulysses S. Grant and Horace Greeley. Grant won the electoral vote 286 to Greeley's 0, in unanimous victory, though it was only because Horace Greeley had passed away between the popular vote count and the electoral vote count, resulting in all electoral voters that did have his name on their ballots to instead change their vote to Ulysses S. Grant. It is worth noting, however, that had Greeley's electoral votes been counted, he still would have lost in a fairly convincing fashion to Grant. Also worth noting that before passing away, Greeley lost the popular vote by almost 12% to Grant. Speaking of popular vote, the biggest landslide by popular vote in order: James Monroe winning by 59.7% over Rufus King, Tom Jefferson over Charles Pinckney by 46.5%, James Madison over Charles Pinckney again by 33.3%, Warren G. Harding over James Cox by 26.3%, Calvin Coolidge over John Davis, winning by 25.2%, and finally Thomas Jefferson again, who beat John Adams by 21.2%. Over the last 15 presidential elections, only once did the loser in the state of Ohio go on to win the presidential election. That was in 2020. That means that for 14 straight elections over the span of 56 years, the candidate who won the state of Ohio would go on to win the presidency. The question is, can we put together a reasoning for this? or is it mere coincidence? For starters, between the 1964 and 2016 election, Ohio had gone blue 6 times and red 8 times, almost split right down the middle, so not much of a pattern to go off of there. In that 56-year span, a total of 8 politicians has held title of governor of Ohio, 3 Democrats and 5 Republicans. There is no correlation between the party of the governor and the party of the winning presidential candidate, so not a real prominent connection there either. How about since its adoption into the United States, Ohio has almost never been considered a blue or red state, but instead it's almost always been considered a battleground swing state. How about Ohio's population growth? Does that seem to have any correlation to the winning presidential candidate? Ohio's population grew at a rate of 1.49% from 1900 to 1950, and from 1950 to 2016 at an increase of 0.61%. The only year that a president was elected where the state's population growth was in the negatives was in 1976 when Jimmy Carter was elected. After hours of researching this subject, the Ohio coincidence seems to be just that, a coincidence. Perhaps a superstition, if you will. Staying on the topic of Ohio, the first president to throw out a ceremonial pitch at a baseball game was Ohio's own William Howard Taft. Taft was the 27th president of the United States, inaugurated in 1909, and served only one term as POTUS. On the afternoon of April 14, 1910, the Washington Senators hosted their first game of their season at the now iconic Griffith Stadium in Washington, D.C. William Howard Taft threw out the very first pitch of the season that year, making history as the first president to do so. Every president from William Howard Taft until John F. Kennedy threw out a ceremonial pitch at the Griffith Stadium for the hometown Washington Senators. Did you know that in the very first presidential election in 1788, George Washington received 69 electoral votes? Anyway, staying on the same subject, the president with the most children in our nation's history is John Tyler. Tyler was the vice president to William Henry Harrison. However, Harrison died only 1 month into his term, so John Tyler took over as POTUS and served for the rest of the term. John Tyler had 15 children, 8 boys and 7 girls. He and his first wife had 8 children. After she passed away, he remarried a woman named Julia Gardner, and they had 7 children. John's first child was born in 1815 when he was 25, and his last child was born in 1860 when he was 70. His last child, Pearl, lived all the way up until the Truman presidency, passing away in 1947. The only president to never have any children was lifelong bachelor James Buchanan, who began his life in politics under Andrew Jackson. He was never married and never had children. However, he was engaged once to a woman named Anne Coleman, who came from a very wealthy family. Buchanan, though, would not sacrifice a minute of his work, ever dedicated to his pursuit in politics. Because of this distance, Anne called off the marriage. There are rumors that James Buchanan may have actually been our first gay president. Divorces weren't really a thing back then, so in most cases of presidents having multiple wives, it is due to the death of their first spouse. Donald Trump is the only president in history to have 3 wives, of which all of them were not divorced because of a death. Grover Cleveland was not married when he was elected president. Therefore, he asked his unmarried sister Rose to serve as his first lady until he was married. Grover Cleveland married Frances Clara in 1886. In 2024, it's no surprise to hear about presidential scandals, from affairs to the Reagan stuff. One scandal that dates all the way back to the 1920s tends to fly a little more under the radar. 1922 President Warren G. Harding's Interior Secretary, Albert Fall, arranged for the Department of Interior to gain control of federal oil reserves in Wyoming. The motivation to obtain these reserves comes into question upon learning what Albert Fall did with these lands. On April 14, 1922, it was reported by the Wall Street Journal that Albert Fall, Secretary of Interior, did not hold a competitive bidding war for the U.S. Naval Petroleum Reserve at Teapot Dome, an oil field in eastern Wyoming. He instead leased the oil field to a private company. The case was taken on by a Senate committee and promptly investigated by Montana Democrat Thomas Welsh. The question that kept getting asked was, how did Albert Fall get so rich? Fall's shady dealings with private oil companies was uncovered. He had been accepting bribes, no-interest loans, and various other gifts in exchange for the drilling rights at Teapot Dome. Montana Democrat Thomas Walsh became an American hero because of the case, and Albert Fall became the first former cabinet member to go to prison. He was convicted of bribery and served 9 months of a 1-year sentence. Interestingly enough, one of his friends who he had accepted bribes from, of the Pan American Petroleum and Transport Company, was acquitted of all charges, and his company was actually able to foreclose on Albert Fall's properties in order to pay off the loans that Fall had received. Fall had received $385,000 as bribery from his deal with Doheny. That would be $7.2 million in 2024 adjusted for inflation. Also an interesting coincidence, Albert Fall was found guilty on the exact same day as Black Thursday, the Wall Street crash of 1929, on October 24th, 1929. Presidents such as Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, Theodore Roosevelt all come to mind when asked who would be the most influential presidents in not only our country's history, but also in the trajectory of our planet. There are some influences that can seem a little more obscure, such as Thomas Jefferson's influence on American cuisine staples. You see, Thomas Jefferson spent a good amount of time in France in the 1780s on behalf of Congress. Thomas spent most of his time in the south of France and northern Italy. And you also see, prior to the 19th century, the American diet was mostly reminiscent of an English diet. Almost all meat was boiled, baked, or stewed. Vegetables weren't consumed often, but when they were boiled as well. Bread and pie were staples, and beverages were mostly ales and hard ciders. In his time in the south of France and northern of Italy, Thomas Jefferson began studying and obtaining knowledge of local farming tools and techniques. One technique he brought back to the colonies was the art of making macaroni for pastas. Other food that Thomas Jefferson was key in spreading was ice cream, French fries, 89 new species of vegetables and herbs, 170 new varieties in fruit, and he highlighted the importance of rich and dense soils through naturally occurring processes. In other words, Thomas Jefferson was a farmer and a gardener in his later years after returning from Europe. Also, in other words, Thomas Jefferson was the first to introduce mac and cheese, ice cream, and French fries to the United States. So, although we've had some great inspirations take office who have altered the trajectory of mankind, how many can say they made French fries the American staple it is today?